The rain fell hard on the busy streets of London that evening. Sarah Mitchell, a 19-year-old university student, hurried across the wet pavement with her backpack slung over one shoulder. She had been studying late at the library again, preparing for her final exams in social work. The streetlights reflected off the puddles as she checked her phone for the time. 9:47 p.m. She was thinking about her upcoming graduation when it happened. A speeding car ran the red light at the intersection. Sarah stepped into the crosswalk, believing she was safe with the walk signal glowing white. The driver, texting on his phone, never saw her coming. The impact threw Sarah 15 feet across the asphalt. Her book scattered everywhere, pages soaking in the rain. Blood pooled beneath her head as she lay motionless on the cold ground. Several people rushed to help, but they were afraid to move her, knowing it could make things worse. Within minutes, the ambulance sirens wailed through the night air. The paramedics worked quickly, checking her pulse and stabilizing her neck. Sarah's breathing was shallow, and she had not opened her eyes since the accident. They loaded her onto a stretcher and raced toward St. Mary's Hospital, the closest trauma center. At the same time, Captain James Morrison of the Royal Guard was finishing his shift at Buckingham Palace. The 32-year-old soldier had served his country for over a decade, but tonight felt different. He had been thinking about his younger sister, who had died in a similar accident 3 years ago. The guilt still haunted him because he was not there when she needed him most. As James drove home through the rain, he noticed the ambulance racing past him with flashing lights. Something inside told him to follow. He could not explain why, but he felt a strong pull to go to the hospital. Maybe it was his training, or maybe it was something deeper, the need to help someone. When he could not help his sister, James parked his car and walked into the emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital. The waiting area was crowded with worried families and tired medical staff. He still wore his Royal Guard uniform, which drew curious looks from other visitors. The red jacket with gold buttons and the tall black hat made him stand out among the casual clothes of everyone else. Near the reception desk, James overheard a nurse talking to a doctor about the young woman who had just arrived. No family members had been contacted yet. She was alone, fighting for her life in the trauma room. The nurse mentioned that the girl had no identification, except for a student card from the local university. Something stirred in James's heart. This stranger reminded him of his sister Emma, who had also been alone when the accident happened. He approached the nurse and asked if he could wait to see how the young woman was doing. The nurse looked surprised but nodded, probably thinking he was a friend or family member. For the next hour, James sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, watching doctors and nurses rush in and out of the trauma room. He did not know why he stayed, but he felt he needed to be there. The girl had no one else, and James understood what it meant to be alone in a moment of crisis. Finally, the doctor emerged from the trauma room looking exhausted. He glanced around the waiting area, searching for family members. When no one stepped forward, James stood up. The doctor walked over, assuming James was connected to the patient somehow. The news was not good. The young woman had suffered severe head trauma, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. She was stable for now, but the next 24 hours would be critical. The doctor explained that she would need surgery and a long recovery time. Most importantly, she would need someone to advocate for her and make medical decisions if she could not. James felt a weight on his shoulders. He knew he had no legal right to make decisions for this stranger, but he also knew he could not walk away. Something about this situation felt like destiny, like he was meant to be here at this exact moment. He thought about his sister Emma and how different things might have been if someone had been there for her. As the night grew longer, James remained in the waiting room. He called his commanding officer to request emergency leave, explaining the situation. His officer was understanding, knowing about James's family tragedy. The Royal Guard had always been more than just a job for James. It was about service, duty, and protecting those who could not protect themselves. When the morning sun finally broke through the hospital windows, James was still there. He had not slept, but he felt more awake than he had in years. The night had changed something inside him, though he did not yet understand what it meant. The morning brought new challenges and difficult decisions. Dr. Patricia Williams, the head of trauma surgery, needed to speak with Sarah's family about the upcoming surgery. When she discovered that no relatives had been contacted and only this uniformed guard was present, she felt confused and concerned. James explained the situation honestly. He told Dr. Williams that he was not family, just someone who felt compelled to help. He shared the story of his sister Emma and how he wished someone had been there for her. Dr. Williams was touched by his sincerity but explained that only family members could make medical decisions. The hospital social worker, Mrs. Chen, arrived to help locate Sarah's family. They searched through her belongings and found her phone, which was cracked but still working. The emergency contacts listed her parents, who lived 4 hours away in Manchester. Mrs. Chen called them immediately. Sarah's parents, David and Margaret Mitchell, were devastated by the news. They owned a small bakery and could not leave immediately due to important business commitments they'd been planning for months. They promised to drive down as soon as possible, but it would take them several hours to arrange coverage for their shop and make the journey. Dr. Williams decided to proceed with the emergency surgery to reduce swelling in Sarah's brain. Every minute counted, and they could not wait for her parents to arrive. James asked if he could stay during the operation, and surprisingly, Dr. Williams agreed. She had worked in emergency medicine for 20 years and had learned to trust her instincts about people. During the 6-hour surgery, James paced the halls of the hospital. He spoke with other families in the waiting room, offering comfort and support. Many were surprised to see a royal guard spending his time helping strangers. But James felt more useful here than he ever had standing at attention outside the palace. An elderly man named Mr. Peterson, his wife was having heart surgery, struck up a conversation with James. He was a veteran who had served in the military decades ago. Mr. Peterson understood the duty, an honor that drove James to help Sarah, even though she was a stranger. Sometimes, Mr. Peterson said, the universe puts us exactly where we need to be, even when we don't understand why. When Sarah finally came out of surgery, Dr. Williams had cautiously good news. The operation had been successful in reducing the pressure on her brain. However, Sarah remained in a coma, and there was no way to predict when or if she would wake up. The next few days would be crucial for her recovery. James was allowed to sit with Sarah in the intensive care unit. The room was filled with beeping machines and the steady sound of the ventilator helping her breathe. Her head was wrapped in white bandages, and her face was swollen and bruised. Despite her injuries, James could see that she was a beautiful young woman with a peaceful expression. He began talking to her, even though the doctors said she probably could not hear him. James told Sarah about his sister Emma, about his work as a royal guard, and about the rainy night that brought them together. He read to her from a book of poems he found in her backpack. Discovering that she loved literature and had written notes in the margins about hope and resilience, when Sarah's parents finally arrived at the hospital, they were amazed to find this uniformed stranger sitting by their daughter's bedside. David Mitchell was initially suspicious and protective, wondering why a complete stranger had taken such interest in his daughter. But Margaret immediately sensed James's genuine care and kindness. James stood up respectfully as Sarah's parents approached. He introduced himself and explained everything that had happened since the accident. He offered to leave so they could have privacy with their daughter, but Margaret asked him to stay. She could see that James had formed a connection with Sarah, and something told her that his presence was important. David Mitchell, a practical man who had built his business through hard work and determination, struggled to understand James's motivations. He questioned why someone would give up their personal time to help a stranger. James answered honestly that he felt called to be there, that maybe this was his chance to do something meaningful that he had not been able to do. For his own sister, as the evening approached, the Mitchells decided to stay overnight at the hospital. James offered to go home and return the next day, but Sarah's condition suddenly changed. Her heart rate increased, and the machines began beeping more rapidly. The medical team rushed in to assess the situation. Dr. Williams explained that Sarah was showing signs of increased brain activity. This could be either a positive development, indicating she was fighting to wake up, or it could signal complications from the surgery. The next 12 hours would be critical in determining which direction her recovery would take. James, David, and Margaret took turns sitting with Sarah throughout the night. James watched as her parents held her hands and whispered words of love and encouragement. He felt both honored to witness their devotion and sad that his sister Emma had died alone without such loving support. Around 3 in the morning, something extraordinary happened. Sarah's eyes fluttered open for just a few seconds. She looked directly at James, though her gaze was unfocused and confused. Then she slipped back into unconsciousness. But those few seconds gave everyone hope that she was still fighting and that recovery was possible. 3 days passed before Sarah opened her eyes again, and this time she stayed awake. The first person she saw was James, sitting in the chair beside her bed, reading aloud from one of her textbooks about social work and helping vulnerable populations. Her vision was blurry. She felt confused about where she was and why this stranger in a military uniform was reading to her. "Water," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible through her dry throat. James immediately called for the nurse and gently helped Sarah take small sips of water through a straw. Dr. Williams arrived quickly to examine her patient, checking Sarah's pupils and testing her reflexes. The results were encouraging. Sarah could move her fingers and toes, remember her name and birthday, and respond to simple commands. However, Sarah had no memory of the accident or the days leading up to it. She could not remember crossing the street, the impact of the car, or being brought to the hospital. Dr. Williams explained that this type of memory loss was common with head injuries and might be permanent or could return gradually over time. When Sarah's parents entered the room, tears of joy streamed down their faces. Margaret held her daughter's hand while David struggled to find words to express his relief. Sarah was happy to see her parents, but felt confused about why everyone seemed so emotional and why there were so many flowers and cards around her bed. James stood to leave, feeling that the family needed private time together, but Sarah stopped him. "Wait," she said softly. "Who are you? Why do I feel like I know you?" David Mitchell explained to his daughter how James had been at the hospital since the night of her accident, staying by her side when they could not be there. Sarah looked at James with curiosity and gratitude, though she could not understand why a complete stranger would care so much about her well-being. "I don't remember much," Sarah admitted, "but I remember your voice. You were reading to me, weren't you? Even when I couldn't respond, I could hear someone reading beautiful words about helping people and making a difference in the world." James felt overwhelmed by emotion. He had not realized that Sarah might have been able to hear him during her coma. For days he had shared his thoughts, fears, and hopes with her unconscious form, never expecting that his words might have reached her somehow. Over the next week, Sarah's physical recovery progressed steadily. She could sit up in bed, eat solid foods, and have longer conversations. The doctors were amazed by how quickly she was healing, both physically and mentally. However, visited Sarah every day after his duties at the palace. He brought her books, flowers from the palace gardens, and stories about his work as a royal guard. Sarah loved hearing about the tourists who visited Buckingham Palace and the formal ceremonies he participated in. His stories helped distract her from the boredom and discomfort of hospital life. During one of their conversations, Sarah asked James about his family. "Emma?" Sarah listened with compassion and understanding, realizing that James's dedication to helping her was connected to his grief and regret about not being able to save Emma. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "maybe you couldn't save your sister, but you saved me. Not just by being here, but by making me feel like I wasn't alone during the scariest time of my life." Sarah's words touched James deeply. For 3 years he had carried the weight of guilt about Emma's death. He had replayed that night countless times, wishing he had been there, wondering if his presence could have made a difference. Helping Sarah had given him a sense of purpose and healing that he had not expected to find. As Sarah grew stronger, she became curious about the accident and what had happened to the driver who hit her. The police investigation revealed that the man had been driving under the influence of alcohol and texting while driving. He would face serious criminal charges, but that knowledge did not make Sarah feel better. Instead, she worried about his family and the consequences his actions would have on their lives. This compassionate response surprised everyone, including Sarah's parents. Despite being the victim of someone's reckless behavior, She felt empathy for the person who had hurt her. Dr. Williams noted that this attitude often indicated a person's true character and suggested it might be related to Sarah's studies in social work. James was impressed by Sarah's ability to find forgiveness and understanding even in her pain. It reminded him of his sister Emma, who had always seen the good in people and believed in second chances. The similarity between Sarah and Emma both comforted and troubled James, making him wonder if his feelings for Sarah were genuine or if he was trying to replace his lost sister. One afternoon, Sarah asked James to help her walk around the hospital corridors. Her balance was still unsteady, but she was determined to regain her strength and independence. As they walked slowly past other patients' rooms, Sarah stopped to chat with people who looked lonely or scared. She offered encouragement to a young boy having surgery and listened to an elderly woman talk about missing her grandchildren. James watched Sarah interact with other patients had realized that her caring nature was not just academic, it was who she truly was as a person. She had a natural gift for making people feel heard and valued, even when she was dealing with her own challenges in recovery. That evening, as visiting hours ended, Sarah asked James a question that surprised him. "When I leave this hospital," she said, "I want you to be the first person I call. Not because you saved me, but because I think we're going to be great friends. Is that okay with you?" James smiled and promised that he would always be available when she needed him, not knowing that this simple promise would change both of their lives in ways they could never have imagined. 2 weeks later, Sarah was finally discharged from the hospital. The morning of her release was filled with mixed emotions, excitement about returning to normal life, but also anxiety about the challenges ahead. Her physical therapy would continue for months, and she still experienced occasional dizzy spells and memory problems that frustrated her. James arrived at the hospital in civilian clothes instead of his Royal Guard uniform. He wore a simple blue sweater and jeans, looking more relaxed than Sarah had ever seen him. He had requested a day off to help Sarah transition back home, something that meant more to her than she could express. Dr. Williams met with Sarah and her parents one final time before discharge. She explained that Sarah's recovery had been remarkable, but reminded them that healing from a traumatic brain injury was a long process that required patience and realistic expectations. Sarah would need to take a break from her university studies and focus on getting better. This news devastated Sarah, who had been just weeks away from graduating with her social work degree. She had worked so hard to achieve her goals, and now everything felt uncertain and delayed. James noticed her disappointment and quietly promised to help her find ways to continue learning and growing during her recovery. Sarah's parents had arranged for her to stay with them in Manchester while she healed, but Sarah felt conflicted about leaving London. The city had become important to her during her recovery, and she did not want to lose touch with James and the life she had been building at university. After much discussion, they reached a compromise. Sarah would spend 2 weeks with her parents to rest and regain her strength, then return to London to continue her recovery. James offered to help her find a safe apartment near the hospital where she could attend physical therapy and counseling sessions. The drive to Manchester gave Sarah her first real glimpse of the world. Outside the hospital, everything seemed brighter and more vivid than she remembered. The countryside looked beautiful, with green fields and small villages that made her appreciate being alive. James sat beside her in the back seat, pointing out interesting landmarks and telling stories to keep her spirits up. At her parents' bakery, Sarah was overwhelmed by the warm welcome from customers and neighbors who had been following her recovery. People brought flowers, homemade meals, and cards expressing their relief that she was safe. Sarah felt touched by the kindness of her community, but also exhausted by all the attention. James stayed for dinner with the Mitchell family that first evening. Margaret had prepared Sarah's favorite meal, roast chicken with vegetables and homemade bread from the bakery. As they ate together, James felt like he was experiencing the family warmth and connection that he had missed after losing Emma and becoming distant from his own parents. David Mitchell had initially been suspicious of James's motives, wondering if this soldier had romantic intentions toward his daughter. But as he watched James interact with Sarah, David realized that their relationship was built on something deeper than romance. It was based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and genuine caring. During the 2 weeks in Manchester, James visited Sarah 3 times. Each visit revealed new aspects of her personality and background. He met her childhood friends, saw the bedroom where she had grown up, and learned about her dreams of becoming a social worker to help children in difficult situations. Sarah showed James the letters she had written to herself as a teenager, describing her goals and ambitions. Even at 16, she had wanted to make a difference in the world and help people who had no one else to advocate for them. James realized that Sarah's compassion for others was not new. It had been part of her character long before the accident. One afternoon, Sarah asked James to walk with her through the town where she had grown up. Her balance was much better now, though she still tired easily. They visited the library where she had spent countless hours studying, the park where she had played as a child, and the church where her family attended services on special occasions. "I keep thinking about what my life would have been like if the accident had never happened," Sarah confided as they sat on a bench overlooking the town. "Would I have graduated on time? Would I have gotten the job I wanted? Would we have ever met?" James considered her question carefully. "I believe everything happens for a reason," he said finally. "Maybe the accident was terrible and unfair, but maybe it also brought us together when we both needed each other most. I was lost after Emma died, and helping you gave me a sense of purpose again." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that too. Before the accident, I was so focused on my studies and future career that I didn't have time for friendships or relationships. Maybe this experience taught me that having people who care about you is just as important as achieving your professional goals." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. It was Dr. Williams calling with unexpected news. The driver who had caused Sarah's accident wanted to meet with her to apologize and take responsibility for his actions. His lawyer had contacted the hospital, asking if Sarah would be willing to participate in a restorative justice meeting. Sarah felt conflicted about the request. Part of her was curious to meet the person whose actions had changed her life so dramatically, but she also felt scared and angry about confronting someone who had hurt her so badly. James encouraged her to take time to think about the decision and reminded her that she did not owe the driver anything, including forgiveness. That evening, Sarah discussed the situation with her parents. Margaret was strongly opposed to the meeting, feeling that it would only cause Sarah more pain and stress. David was more open to the idea, believing that facing the driver might help Sarah find closure and move forward with her healing. James offered to accompany Sarah if she decided to meet with the driver, but he also made it clear that the choice was entirely hers. "Whatever you decide," he told her, "I'll support you completely. You've already shown incredible strength and grace throughout this whole experience. Trust yourself to make the right decision." After 3 days of careful consideration, Sarah made her choice. She would meet with the driver, but only with James and her parents present, and only in a neutral location with a mediator. She wanted to look him in the eye and understand how someone could make such a devastating mistake. More importantly, she wanted to tell him about the impact of his actions and hopefully prevent him from hurting anyone else in the future. The restorative justice meeting took place in a quiet conference room at the community center in Manchester. Sarah felt nervous as she entered the room with James by her side and her parents following closely behind. The mediator, Mrs. Roberts, was an experienced counselor who specialized in helping victims and offenders find healing through dialogue and understanding. The driver who had hit Sarah was a 28-year-old man named Michael Harrison. He worked as an accountant and had 2 young children. When Sarah first saw him, she was surprised by how ordinary and remorseful he appeared. She had imagined someone who looked dangerous or careless, but Michael seemed broken by guilt and shame over what he had done. Michael's wife, Jennifer, sat beside him with tears in her eyes. She had brought photos of their children and a letter that Michael had written to Sarah, but had been too afraid to send. The couple looked exhausted and stressed. Clearly struggling with the consequences of that terrible night, Mrs. Roberts began the meeting by explaining the ground rules and ensuring that everyone felt safe to speak honestly. She emphasized that this was not a legal proceeding, but rather an opportunity for healing and understanding. Sarah had the right to ask questions, express her feelings, and set boundaries for the conversation. Michael was the first to speak. His voice shook as he apologized to Sarah and her family. He explained that he had been drinking at a work celebration and had made the terrible decision to drive home instead of calling a taxi. He had been texting his wife to tell her he was on his way when he ran the red light and hit Sarah. "I think about that moment every single day," Michael said, struggling to control his emotions. "I wake up every morning wishing I could go back and make a different choice. I know that nothing I say can undo the pain I've caused you and your family." Sarah listened quietly, studying Michael's face and trying to understand the person behind the mistake. She could see genuine remorse in his eyes, but she also felt angry about the selfishness of his choices that night. James noticed her hands trembling and quietly reached over to offer his support. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and looked directly at Michael. "I want you to understand what your choices cost me," she said with quiet strength. "I missed my graduation. I had to put my career on hold. I spent weeks in the hospital fighting for my life. My parents aged 10 years in a single night worrying about whether I would survive." Michael nodded, accepting every word of Sarah's anger and pain. His wife Jennifer wiped away tears as she listened to the full impact of her husband's actions on an innocent person's life. But then Sarah surprised everyone in the room. "I also want you to know that this experience has taught me things I never would have learned otherwise," she continued. "I discovered how strong I am. I learned that strangers can become family when you need them most. I found out that my parents would do anything to protect me, and I met James, who showed me what true kindness looks like." James felt moved by Sarah's words, but also concerned that she was being too generous with her forgiveness. He had seen how much she had suffered and did not want her to minimize her own trauma to make Michael feel better. Michael asked if there was anything he could do to help with Sarah's medical expenses or recovery costs. David Mitchell explained that their insurance had covered most of the bills, but Sarah's lost income and delayed graduation had created financial stress for the family. Without hesitation, Michael offered to cover Sarah's remaining student loans and support her living expenses while she completed her recovery and finished her degree. Jennifer nodded in agreement, explaining that they had been saving money for their children's education but felt this was a more important use of their resources. Sarah was touched by the offer, but felt uncomfortable accepting money from the person who had hurt her. She worried that it might create an unhealthy dynamic or make Michael feel like he could buy his way out of responsibility for his actions. Mrs. Roberts suggested a different approach. Instead of direct financial support, Michael could make a donation to organizations that help accident victims and their families. Sarah could also speak at community events about drunk driving prevention, with Michael sharing his perspective on how one mistake can destroy multiple lives. This idea appealed to Sarah because it would allow her to turn her traumatic experience into something positive that could help others. She had always wanted to make a difference in the world, and now she could use her story to potentially save lives by encouraging people to make better choices. As the meeting continued, Sarah learned more about Michael's background. He had grown up in a stable family, had a good education, and had never been in trouble with the law before. His drinking problem had developed gradually over several years as work stress increased and his marriage faced challenges. "I don't want you to think I'm making excuses," Michael explained. "What I did was inexcusable, regardless of what was happening in my life. But I want you to know that I'm getting help now. I'm attending alcohol treatment meetings and seeing a therapist too. Understand how I got to that point." Jennifer shared that Michael had not had a drink since the night of the accident and was committed to staying sober for the rest of his life. She also mentioned that they were attending marriage counseling to address the problems that had contributed to Michael's drinking and poor decision-making. Toward the end of the meeting, Sarah asked Michael to promise her something. "I want you to remember my face and my story every time you're tempted to drink and drive again. And I want you to share what happened with other people so they don't make the same mistake you did." Michael agreed immediately, and Jennifer promised to support him in keeping that commitment. They asked if they could stay in touch with Sarah to update her on Michael's progress and to continue making amends for the harm he had caused. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt emotionally drained, but also strangely peaceful. She had looked her trauma in the eye and found a way to transform it into something meaningful. James admired her courage and grace throughout the difficult conversation. Knowing that not everyone could find such strength in the face of injustice, walking out of the community center, Sarah leaned on James's arm and smiled for the first time since the accident. "I think I'm ready to go back to London now," she said. "I have work to do." 6 months after the accident, Sarah stood in front of a packed auditorium at the University of London. She wore a simple black dress and held her graduation cap in her hands. Finally ready to receive the social work degree she had worked so hard to earn, the ceremony had been delayed, but the achievement felt even more meaningful because of everything she had overcome to reach this moment. James sat in the third row, wearing his dress Royal Guard uniform at Sarah's special request. He had been promoted to senior captain after his commanding officers learned about his dedication to helping Sarah and other hospital patients during his time off. His actions had brought positive attention to the Royal Guard and demonstrated the values of service and compassion that the organization represented. Sarah's parents beamed with pride as their daughter walked across the stage to receive her diploma. Margaret wiped away tears as she remembered the dark nights when they had not known if Sarah would survive, let alone graduate. David felt amazed by his daughter's resilience and determination to turn her trauma into a force for good in the world. After the graduation ceremony, Sarah was approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the director of a new program at London General Hospital. Dr. Walsh had heard about Sarah's story and her work speaking to community groups about accident prevention. She offered Sarah a position as a patient advocate, helping families navigate the healthcare system during medical crises. The job was perfect for Sarah because it combined her social work training with her personal experience of being a patient and understanding the fear and confusion that comes with serious injuries. She would be able to help other people the way James had helped her during those frightening first days in the hospital. James had also found new direction in his life. He had started volunteering with a charity that supported families of military personnel who had died in service. Working with other people who had lost loved ones helped him process his grief over Emma's death and find ways to honor her memory through service to others. That evening, Sarah and James celebrated at a small restaurant near the hospital where they had first met. The owner, Mr. Patel, had heard their story from other customers and insisted on preparing a special meal to mark Sarah's graduation. He had lost his own son in a car accident years earlier and felt inspired by how Sarah and James found healing through helping others. As they ate dinner, Sarah reflected on how much their lives had changed since that rainy night. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't followed that ambulance to the hospital?" she asked James. James considered the question carefully. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But I believe we would have found each other eventually. Maybe not that night, maybe not in that way, but somehow. People who are meant to be in each other's lives find a way to connect." Sarah smiled at his response. Their relationship had evolved from patient and caregiver too. Genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared experiences. They had helped each other heal from their respective traumas and had found purpose in serving others who faced similar challenges. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from Michael Harrison. He had been sober for nearly a year and was scheduled to speak at a high school assembly about the dangers of drunk driving. He wanted Sarah to know that her forgiveness and example had motivated him to become an advocate for responsible decision-making and alcohol awareness. Michael also shared that his marriage was stronger than ever after working through their problems and counseling. His children were proud of how he had taken responsibility for his mistake and was working to prevent others from making similar errors. The family had started volunteering together at a local food bank. Finding healing through service to their community, Sarah was pleased to hear about Michael's progress, but was even more excited about the impact their story was having on others. She had received dozens of letters from people who had attended her speaking events and decided to make better choices about drinking and driving. Several had credited her with saving their lives or the lives of others. James, had also found fulfillment in sharing his story. He spoke to military groups about coping with loss and finding purpose after trauma. His message resonated with service members who had experienced combat stress or lost friends in battle. He emphasized that healing often comes through helping others, rather than focusing solely on personal recovery. On the first anniversary of Sarah's accident, she and James returned to the intersection where everything had changed. They brought flowers to honor not just Sarah's survival, but also the transformation that had grown out of tragedy. They had both learned that the most meaningful healing often comes from using personal pain to prevent suffering in others. Standing at the corner where Sarah had been struck, James thought about his sister, Emma, and how proud she would be of the person he had become through helping Sarah. Sarah thought about the scared, injured girl she had been a year ago and marveled at the strength and purpose she had discovered in herself. As they walked away from that intersection, Sarah took James's arm and smiled. "You know what the best part is?" she said. "We're just getting started. Think of all the people we haven't helped yet, all the lives we haven't touched, all the difference we can still make." James nodded, feeling grateful for the unexpected friendship that had grown from a moment of crisis. They had learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do for others. Their story had become proof that healing is possible, that strangers can become family, and that even the darkest nights can lead to the brightest mornings. Together, they walked toward their future, knowing that their bond had been forged not just by shared trauma, but by shared hope and a commitment to making the world a little bit safer and kinder for everyone they encountered. The wounded girl and the Royal Guard had found their purpose in each other's healing, and their story would continue to inspire others for years to come.